So we created all the files we're going to need for our AngularJS application. And I went ahead and I populated these files, so let's take a look at them. In the previous video, we set up all our scripts in our index.html file. And let's start by looking at the application itself, Angular Forms app.js. So we're simply going to create a global variable, and this will be the only global variable we use in the app. And we're going to set this to our Angular module. So we're creating a module which will be our app called Angular Forms app. And we're not going to specify any other modules right now as dependencies. Later on when we use UI Bootstrap, we'll be adding that here, but for now we can just leave it empty. It's an empty array. So that's pretty simple for our application. Let's look at the controller, efcontroller.js. Looking at the controller, we take our global app variable and we call the controller method on it. This will enable us to create an Angular controller. We'll call it efcontroller, and we'll also pass the method a function called efcontroller, and that's where we'll get our scope. And it also takes a reference to the service, efservice, which we'll take a look at soon. And all the controller is doing is setting up the $scope variable. We'll set its employee field to the services employee field. So that's pretty simple. Let's take a look at the efservice now. In efservice.js, we take our application variable and we call the factory method. And in Angular, the factory method creates a service. We'll call the service efservice, and we'll just pass it a function that returns an employee. And this is just some sample data that I plugged in right now. It's not going to go out to the web server until later on in the course. But for now, you can see we have regular fields that you might see in an employee form. A name, some notes, a department, and some possible perks, and a payroll type. And we'll take a look at the form in more detail soon, but for now, just know that our service is going to return an employee. And going back to the controller, we just saw how the services employee gets set back to the scopes employee. Now another file we have is the directive, but before we look at efdirective.js, let's take a look at index.html. I added all the regular Angular attributes here. We have our ng app is set to Angular Forms app, and I'm putting the controller on the body tag. So our ng-controller is efcontroller. And to get our form to show up, I'm using HTML's declarative syntax. We're creating a directive called employee-form. So it should be pretty obvious where the employee form is going to show up. We don't need a div, we can just directly call the tag employee-form. And to be able to do this, let's take a look at efdirective.js. So we're taking our global app object and we're calling the directive method. And we're passing it the name of the directive. And you'll notice this is in camel case. It starts with a lowercase letter and the next word begins with a capital letter. But all this is going to get translated into snake case. If we look back at index.html, you can see the directive is actually employee-form, following HTML conventions. So in the directive, just know that this is going to get translated into -lowercase f when it comes time to use the directive. And we're also passing the directive method a function, which returns an object with two items. Restrict means we want to use this directive only as an element. That's what the E stands for. And we're also passing it the template URL, which if you look at it, it points to our eftemplate.html file. So that's all it really takes to set up our own directive with Angular. We give it the name and we return an object full of options. So let's take a look at eftemplate.html. And this is essentially our form. It starts with a form tag and it ends with the form tag. And this is our view. Anything that we want to show up in the index.html page where we're using this employee form tag, this employee-form tag will be replaced with eftemplate.html by Angular. So that's how the form gets embedded in the page. So that covers all the files we added. Let's run it, take a look. So we have our form. It needs a little bit more styling though. We want to get it away from the top and add a margin to the left. One easy way to do that is to use Bootstrap. If we go into index.html, we can go on our body tag and add a class. Container is part of Bootstrap, which centers all the content on a page, and it will control the margins, which is really useful if you want a responsive page. Now normally you would put some kind of top margin too, but for now, since this is a demo, I'll just put a line break and I'll run it. Alright, so we have our form. We have fields for the name, notes, select with 4 options. We have some checkboxes for perks, and we have radio buttons for a payroll type. And because we're styling this with Bootstrap, it is responsive. If we shrink it down to a smartphone size, you can see that the margins are maintained a little bit, and the form still looks pretty good. So we have an Angular.js application up and running. We created a module, and to that module we added a controller, a service, a directive, and a view. The view is simply the template.html file. And we'll be working with this form more in this course.